I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing.
My guest today is someone I've worked with before, is a really exciting writer and layout designer of their own work. My guest today is Joe Winter. Thank you for joining me on the podcast, Joe. Would you like to introduce yourself more fully to the audience?
Yeah, of course. My name's Joe Winter. I release games under, I guess, the header Wintertide Games. It was mainly just so I had something pithy to call the itch page I release my games under more than anything. I'm not gonna lie. What do I make? So I make a variety of TTRPG stuff. I kind of flit about a lot. I wouldn't I don't think there's a cohesive pitch. I guess all my games focus on queerness. I'm just sort of writing silly things that I think are entertaining, to be honest.
Yeah, I have the same thing. I remember I once met someone at a thing who also designed RPGs, so my friend who was introducing us went, "Oh, this is my friend Kayla, she also does RPGs." And then this person just immediately asked me, how do you describe what you do? And I'm like, I do too much random shit to have figured out a good line.
Yeah, I always like to sometimes think of what if in another world I really hyper focused on one specific thing, and I feel like there's definitely points where I want to do that, but on the whole I kind of just dipping my toes into various different kind of forms of design.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting thing, and that does make looking across your range of work very interesting. And it's also something I, to be honest, like about my own work, that it is hard to summarize in any kind of mechanical or genreistic sense. Genreistic isn't a word, is it?
Ludistic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an issue, right? Because genre in this medium can refer to both the setting and tone, but it can also refer to particular gameplay DNA, whether that's powered by the apocalypse or Forged in the Dark or other design sensibilities.
I feel there's maybe a world out there where I'm someone who's just I'm really just solidly a belonging outside belonging designer, and that's all I do. Or maybe there's one where I say I in some way make exclusively action games, but as it is, I'm I bounce, which is fun and fine.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good space to occupy, I think.
Absolutely. So, leading in with biographical questions, where did you grow up? Because we both I was about to say where we both live, and then I'm maybe you don't want to be doxed on the podcast. I
mean, you can say I live in London.
Yeah, that's fine. Broad enough.
A large number of people in the UK. For better or worse, it is a metropole. But yeah, so I grew up in the south of England, specifically Bournemouth, which is It occupies a weird space in terms of size. It's quite a Tory town, but it's also big for a town. There there was an argument made a few years back that it should be a city, and I think that's context that is, I don't know, interesting and I valuable to an extent. But so grew up near the sea. I think that's definitely something that crops up in my work a bit. We can talk about that more later. Yeah, Bournemouth. It's like Brighton but worse.
Brighton's not officially a city, more Tory cousin, essentially.
Yeah, it's it's also just the Bournemouth is a weird one to pin down because it's used to be started off as a Victorian tourist town essentially, and a lot of that shows in kind of the culture of the town. That there's obviously, it's not an entirely middle class town, but it definitely feels like there isn't as strong cultural identity as other places, just by virtue of it like for its entire existence has kind of just been a place that people go to. Like there isn't particularly much industry down there, at least to my like that I have seen. Like the labor there's not much of a functional labor movement, I wouldn't say. Yeah, I don't know. It also just like the vibes are off sometimes. It's weird because it's a very beautiful area to live in, like scenery wise, and I feel very lucky for having had that. But also, there's a lot of factors that come together to make it a bit weird.
Yeah. Did you always have the impression that like someday you'd move out of Bournemouth, or was there any part of you that ever thought about staying there?
That's a tricky one. I feel like up till a certain age, that's just not something I thought about. I guess so some other context. My parents are divorced, and my mum moved a few times over the course of like my school years. So like, initially lived in Bournemouth, but then for a point I was split between Bournemouth and Poole, which is like nearby but still like its own place. And then she moved further out to Wareham, which is like maybe an hour drive away, same county, but like enough of a kind of geographical break, I guess, that that existed. And also like I was pretty anti that whole move. Like it kind of, the way I saw it, like especially as a teenager, was that I was having to spend a load of time in a place where I didn't really know anyone, that didn't have any friends, much smaller like town as well, like more of a village really. Like not many of the amenities that like me being a kid kind of enjoyed, like a cinema that you could go to that had decent showings. Like I don't know. Also, just like I didn't know it, right?
Yeah,
and when you're that young, you don't have the ability to travel back and forth very easily. All of which like meant that for a long time, it felt like I was trying to get back to Bournemouth. I guess. Just like due to how like what my like family situation was like. But like once I kind of started getting like older teens, I definitely think I kind of had the idea that I wanted to go somewhere else. I didn't have a strong idea of what that looked like beyond going to uni, which in retrospect was a little short-sighted, I think. But
yeah, that makes...
Bournemouth is also just like the South Coast in general is a bit of a weird one, because like you want to go anywhere north, you're like already like kind of the furthest away you can get. So just like I haven't been to that many places in the UK to my discredit, just by virtue of like having broadly been situated down south, and since I've moved to London, having not had much money.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Do you think like in terms of like when you are writing in your games about, you know, places, especially with say like the fall of home, do you think you are writing about Bournemouth?
Very much so, yes, especially in the case of the fall of home. I think actually this is just a good point to talk about the fall of home.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So, for people who don't know, Fall of Home is like my most recent / like biggest release, I guess. I ran it as a zine quest a few years back and was pretty happy with how that went. And I think I did a good job on the layout as well. But that version of the game was a remaster or a second edition of like one of the very first things I wrote when I started like actively trying to design TTRPGs. And that I wrote that over the course of first COVID lockdown, because I had like essentially moved back in with parents because it was that or be in a flat essentially alone, right? And we're going into the pandemic, no one really had an idea of how long it was going to be. I wasn't sure what my like money situation was going to be like. It turned out that I ended up getting furloughed, and that helped a lot in terms of stability and being able to like try and mount doing RPGs more fully. But like, yeah, so I moved back home, and that was really weird. And a lot of that game is about that, I think, experience.
Yeah, like the structure in at play and the way of creating a place. I can see how it's very informed by like a personal attitude of like looking back on a location and engaging with it in a very different light or perspective.
Yeah. It was also like, I guess on top of the context of the pandemic and that whole like kind of forced return in a way. It wasn't forced, it was my choice, but like circumstances conspired to make it such that going home seemed like the right
it was a choice, but like
but also this was
there was lots of context to it that affected that choice.
Yes. Other things that I think like are important to note about my life at that point, so I came out as trans like in uni. I studied in London, so I came up to London for uni and then just have never really left. So this was the first time being back in that space, knowing I was queer and like having come to terms with aspects of my identity that I didn't know before, and that's just a whole like recontextualizing thing. Also, just like, yeah, I was on the back end of uni at that point. I hadn't like done the weird pseudo dropout graduation thing that I ended up doing, but I had sort of figured out that it was heading in that direction by that point.
So were you still technically at uni during the time lockdown happened?
And then there's also... Yes, so I was... what was it specifically? I was taking a year out. I think I had confirmed that I was taking a year out, but had started to think about what going back looked like and was increasingly more sure that I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue. And there's a whole host of reasons I could get into about that, but I feel like that could get a bit lost in the
yeah,
weeds.
sure, that makes sense. Do you feel like some of the walks in Fall of Home, which are the sort of individual like playbooks essentially building on, do you think some of them were informed by your perspective at that time? Do you see yourself in like any more or less one of them, or through all
absolutely.
of them in different ways?
All of them in different ways, for sure. Like so one of the things I really wanted to do when I wrote Fall of Home, when I wrote the new edition, I'm like, I'll just call it Fall of Home because like I consider the first version essentially like a precursor, like first attempt, first like experiment more than an actual like. No, it's cohesive, but where was I going with that?
I think you were talking about the walks influencing you.
Apologies.
I do love, by the way, that we both have belonging outside belonging games that are inspired by having returned to our hometown after or near the end of university, after having come out of transit university in London.
Yeah, it's what's up with that? I wonder if there's a reason we're friends. So yeah, I definitely like, yeah, coming into it, I definitely wanted to represent my own experience, and like in kind of thinking about how to mechanicize these things, I think I ended up like learning a bit more about how I felt about things, but also like I am very aware that like, you know, other people have different relationships to the places they live, and some of them aren't positive. Like I would say mine was on the whole positive, but like I wanted to give room for people to have like more complicated, more messy, more like, I wanted people to come to the game and be able to bring in like, you know, whatever aspect of the human experience they've had, and have there be something there for them, which is obviously a hard design proposition, and distilling it down into 6 like archetypal classes is never really entirely going to do that, but I wanted to, do as much of it as I felt like.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, in particular, they're definitely like, what is it? It's the fledgling and the academic are, like, I would definitely say more heavily informed by my own experience, like, my own particular life experiences, kind of having left home and returning. One of them I kind of see as me before I left, and then one as me coming back, and like kind of trying to like, the two definitely are informed by each other, I think, in that way, just by virtue of like, I kind of see the academic as the fledgling like 6 years down the line. Or I don't know, maybe not 6 years, 4 or 5 years. I like being realistic about how I wrote that and how far out I was at that point. But yes.
So it was also
there's a reason that the academic has my name.
Yes, I did actually. I remember noticing that. That's. It almost feels like you signing the walk in that way. I was just going to say, was trying to like cover a different range of experiences or experiences and perspectives. Was that part of why you brought in like 2 stretch goal writers for the like properly crowdfunded version?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I can make up guys in my head, but nothing is ever like gonna be quite as good as someone else making up a guy in their own way. Also, I'm a big fan of collaborating with other people. Like, it's one of my favorite things to do in kind of the work I've done. So like any opportunity I have to like chuck a bit of money to some designers I think are cool and who I get on with and who I think make cool work, is something it's one of my favorite bits of making stuff. So there's definitely a slightly selfish cathartic thing there for me, I guess, but I think it gets good stuff, so I'm not going to apologize.
It's really cool and nice to like have like created something and then get to see it in a different way through someone else's eyes, which is obviously what you get out of people playing the game. Also, I think that's a really nice thing of like hiring people to do some stretch goals or stuff.
Yeah, it also felt like it felt like doing so was very resonant with the premise of the game and the structure that the narrative takes.
That actually,
I guess to elucidate a bit more, Fall of Home. So you're actually I haven't even talked about what the game actually.
Yeah, you should actually
is about,
do a quick coverage of what the game is, and then
Fall of Home. I should do that.
And then you can explain the structure a bit more, and I have a question about the structure, so that's a useful order.
Okay. Yeah. So the elevator pitch is your hometown has been destroyed, altered irrevocably. It's left vague by some kind of disaster that is both real but also metaphysical to some degree. Like, there's some weirdness happening. It's not supposed to. There's no like. It's supposed to be a bit uncanny and a bit like time is a bit out of whack in this place, I guess. But it's you and a group of people who you all meet on the road back to your hometown, traveling there to like see what remains of it, and see if there's any see if you can salvage anything, or even just to kind of give it a goodbye, I guess. And everyone is going back for different reasons, and so the story is kind of told in the form of like flashback scenes inspired by these physical objects or sensations or things that you find exploring the ruins of this place, and kind of almost as like campfire chat, you telling the other people that you're with about, I don't know, a particular memory you have had of this place. It's like there's a bit of city building in there as well, but it's broadly pretty free-flowing, pretty narrative, GM-less. Trying to create room to have feelings, I guess.
Yeah, I really like the sort of spirit and heart and attitude of the game. Like, I feel it like my family had like a lot of like bonfires as a kid, and for some reason it's a game that sort of instantly sort of puts me in the mind of being around a fire, and the structure of how sort of the structure of like scenes and acts, like both like meeting on the road and then the whole sort of arc in the game, I think really does like facilitate the like the kind of storytelling in it that is very exciting. And I was interested in where you drew influence on that sort of structure and scenes and acts. Was it coming from other analog games, from video games, theater, or somewhere else?
Um, so there was definitely some that I was kind of pulling, some of that structure that I was pulling from games that I had played at the time. I One of the um, most impactful and longest enduring memories I have of any like tabletop game is like an online game of Sleepaway I played a few years back, and I really liked how that game, there's like a degree to which actions you can take are mechanicized and their scenes kind of exist, but I like that it's deliberately like left open to make stuff as tight or as freeform as you want, especially compared to, you know, like your classic D&D very structured combat heavy
Yeah, I really love
type thing. I Yeah, it's yeah, Jay knocked it out of the park with that one, huh? But also like just kind of like filmic language in general. I like a lot of how I ended up getting as into TTRPGs as I am now is from listening to various actual play podcasts, and the ones of those that I always enjoyed, again, like kind of tried to like both use a lot of like filmic language and like framing scenes, but also like being thoughtful in that way, and giving other players like levers by which to introduce tiny little wrinkles or like alternative viewpoints that like just kind of subtly recontextualize stuff. And so I knew I wanted to have like a degree of like a collaborative nature to it. It's why I ultimately ended up going GMless. I think that when everyone has equal license to embellish and to suggest camera movement, that kind of thing, really adds it really adds to any experience.
Yeah, I definitely think
for me personally. So
I definitely think like GMless works
that.
for the sense where it's, you know, about a place and about how a place is shaped by memories. I do think like those sort of like scene elements being just framed by one person would, you know, a good game could exist within that, but it would be a different game, like massively so.
Yes. I suppose thinking about it, another influence that like was very big here is how the Quiet Year handles discussion around things and conflicting desires and relationships within a community to a place. And yeah, that was also definitely a big like touchstone for me.
Fall of Home is named after a song, and let's see how that song's from, like, as media that informed the game. I wanted to, I guess, ask more about like that specific inspiration there, but also how music informs your work in general.
Yeah, okay. So that song in particular was chosen because I guess for one, Los Campesinos, the band, of which the game is named after a song of theirs, were a band that I was very into when I still lived in Bournemouth. It was I got into them through friends in sixth form, and it was the first time that I'd ever kind of engaged with music with other people in that way, and had like had friends with the same music taste as me, and so that felt. So, you know, I've been a fan of them for ages, and representing the fact that like a lot of my enduring memories of Bournemouth at the point in which I wrote it were like kind of in relation to that sort of sixth form period, because it was like the most fully formed I'd been when I was in that place last, I guess. I also just think they're a great band and I like their politics. I appreciate it when artists take the time to shout out things that are actually happening, whether like in politics. I think it's good to be engaged politically. Actually, I'm sure we will come back to that. But yeah, it was. Yeah, so that was my main inspiration. It's also a song that is very much about the experience of returning home and like seeing how things have changed, and like gentrification to an extent, and like increased deprivation due to austerity is like also definitely a theme. But also just like I like talking about music. Music's fun. It was really fun to work with Molly to create a soundtrack for the game, of which six.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so there's without getting into the whole, I collaborated with her a lot, giving direction on that, and it was really fun to do. But the really fun thing that I enjoyed from that was that each of the 6 playbooks, I call them walks, don't I? Each of the 6 walks has a song that is essentially like the kind of music that character would listen to. So it was fun to be able to like different genre stuff for each of those. It meant one of them gets to be very like 80s synth. There's one that's like quite punk. There's others that are a bit more like kind of hardcore, getting fast with it. Yeah, it was great just like being able to include all these different nods to music
Use
that I
music
like
as
in
characterization.
These characters. Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool. It's also only just clicked that the other thing both of our BOB hometown returning games are also both named after songs.
Yeah, I feel there's, especially I think because I was like, I'm at the risk of sounding incredibly fake deep here, I think, but like when songs hit, they hit, right? And especially in context to like, they're often a way that you encounter other people having had similar experiences to you, just by virtue of how like it feels like a lot of songs wear their heart on their sleeve.
Yeah.
And also just provide an opportunity for people to speak more in a more emotionally true way than prose necessarily does sometimes. Obviously, you know, prose can do all the same things, and it's a different medium and it has its own strengths, but there's something like both more easily digestible about music, and also just, I don't know, I find music very affecting when it's good and it hits close to home. And I think that it's a powerful force for that.
Yeah, Swamp Creature, I think every playbook has like a quote as part of the layout that is either a song or a poem, because it's often sort of a, well, here's a kind of like raw injection of what this playbook is maybe about. It's also it's the kind of thing where I didn't clear any of them, so that's that's the ticking time bomb on Swamp Creature.
It's fine.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Fair use or something.
It's transformative.
Yeah, no, literally,
I
right?
actually think it's transformative. Yeah, that is how it should work. I wouldn't necessarily want to get a fight in it, but also I don't think I'll ever get in trouble.
Yeah, there's
But
I would also like, if it comes to a point where people are coming after you, that means you've made it. You know, like they think there's money sloshing around there, and that's a good place to be.
Yeah, honestly, I get a cease and desist letter from everyone, I'm selling t-shirts of it.
Yeah,
I'll use the cease and desist letter in my next game or whatever. But also, please no one cease and desist me. I would not like to desist. But beyond music, there's like a slightly larger list of influences that back and fall of home, and they bring together lots of seemingly disparate works. And I wondered if you could expand on those influences, what things you were drawing on, what you drew through them. I'm also interested in the compiling and like the publication of lists of influences, and like where you place that, and what is sort of what the aim is often with that. As someone who frequently does include list of influences that I'm like, I don't think these make sense to anyone other than me.
Yeah. Okay, so hang on, just let me just grab the zine from my shelf so I can have a look at the ones I've actually listed here. I have a broad idea, but it's been a while. So some of them are definitely more thematic, others mechanical, others aesthetic. I'll elaborate on that a bit. So like one of the things I got here is Bastion, which is Supergiant Games' first game. I've been a big fan of all their games for forever, but I played that one when it came out, and in that game you are journeying a world that is literally falling apart. As you walk around, bits of like floating island coalesce to form the level around which you're moving, and there's also points at which that goes in reverse and everything starts to disintegrate, and it's a bad time. But I really liked kind of the way that Bastion approaches the past and memory and how that relates to physicality and the ways our mind, like, I guess, remembers and links memories. Night in the Woods, I feel like doesn't really need explaining. Night in the Woods is
if you know Night in the Woods, I think you get where that's coming from.
Yeah, I wasn't subtle about that one. Illustrations in the book, which are all done by Connor Fawcett, who was an artist that I've been a fan of for forever, and it was a delight to be able to work with them on this. But a lot of the illustrations in the book are inspired by, I guess a similar touchstone would be Annihilation, or the Chernobyl exclusion zone as well to an extent. When you see like man-made structures that have been like abandoned and reclaimed by nature in that way, sometimes like falling apart and having like showing the years, but other times like almost weirdly timeless, like or out of time.
Yeah.
And Laputa was a big thing for me with that. I'm a real Ghibli head. Other things, so there's a few like TTRPGs that I was reading at the time that I was designing this, and I like to nod to where I've gotten the inspiration or like direction for mechanics, just because I feel like as a medium, TTRPGs are very iterative, and that's a really good thing. But it's nice to like let people know what inspired you, because maybe it'll inspire them, right?
It's nice to draw the lines.
Yeah, and that's sort of why I like doing kind of like this list of references or suggested media. It's on one hand, they serve as good like touchstones for people who have also played, read, watched those things, but also they give someone something to go and enjoy if they enjoy this. It's both in conversation with, but like signposting people to those works, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely sometimes if I've done big lists of things, there's definitely sometimes where I'm like, I'm kind of including this, like, A, because it was an inspiration, but also as a recommendation.
Yeah, no, for sure. I feel like there's also like a thing that I guess just is part of how I personally think about games, which is that when I examine something, I draw a lot of comparisons between it and other things that I have read, watched, played, in ways that help me understand the whole by looking at the similarities and looking at the differences between each of those and seeing and like letting that kind of... It helps me to draw out the creative choices that have been made, right? Because... Or at least the creative choices that you can infer have been made. Obviously, like, you can't read the author's mind. The author is dead. But, yeah.
Yeah, but you can look at their footprints or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Or fossils, yeah. No, that makes sense. Like, yeah, drawing lines between points to create not necessarily a map, but a image that can be analysed.
Yes.
I think I got too
yes.
deep into analogy stuff.
No, I actually think you really nailed it with that one, to be honest. You put it better than I
Sick.
think I could have.
So I think that's the end of like the direct questions I had on Fall of Home. But as we talk about sort of different approaches, like to your work in general, we'll probably be coming back to it in different ways. What I wanted to jump back to as a biographical question that I think may lead into some other more specific questions was asking about like what previous jobs you've done and how you might feel like they have informed work, because I think there's one answer that comes to mind here.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so, I have done a few jobs. I did a bit of retail, when I was still in sixth form. So that was, like, on first, like, a deli and cheese counter, and then the meat counter at my local Waitrose. I did, like, bar back and barista stuff at, like, a beachside, cafe place near where I live. But I'd like my, I guess, longest employment was as a bartender in London in a few pubs. First one fairly central, and then after the pandemic, a few others for less and less time at each post, as I slowly realized that actually I kind of hate a lot of that work. It's difficult.
Yeah.
Like there's a certain amount of satisfaction I get from doing any job well, and when I was like on top of my game on bartending, it feels really good because you feel like you're firing on all cylinders. But it's evenings, so you don't get much social life unless it's with other people who work in bars, and I quite like staying in contact with the friends I already have, which makes doing both of those at the same time hard. It also is a very precarious profession. 0-hour contracts are the norm in my experience. It's like there are definitely places that aren't quite so rough to work for, but at least like my exposure to it was mostly that. It's also, I think, just reflects a change in the things I value in my life as to why I have ended up moving away from that. Which we can get onto later. But yeah, so the main project that is informed by all of that, it would be Last Orders. It's Last Orders is a collection of like 16 like micro adventure plot hook type things, each of which themed around a different like fictional fantasy craft beer, ale, cider, mead, what have you. And that was largely an attempt on my end to monetize all this like oblique craft beer knowledge that I have from having worked in craft beer pubs for about 3.5 years, and turning that into something that was at least mildly more interesting to me, that being tabletop games. But yeah, it was that was also a really fun project. It was my first time I'd kickstarted anything, and that was a whole ride, like learning how to do crowdfunding. But it was also the first time I'd gotten someone to do art for my project, and that was great fun. I very much wrote it with Dungeons and Dragons in mind, knowing that that's what a lot of people play, and I wanted it to be at least compatible with that, just to give it a chance of making me some money. In retrospect, I don't really like that impulse. There's obviously, like, it's important to consider, especially if you're making something that is intended to be a commercial product, but I think it's bad when commercial decisions inform your creative practice, actually.
Do you think there is a different angle you'd have taken on this if you were writing it today?
Oh, that's interesting. This kind of branches into another thing that I think I ended up doing sort of incidentally in Last Orders. That being, it was my first time writing something that was intended to be like system neutral. And so a lot of me finding ways to kind of give stuff mechanical crunch was creating little systems that operate essentially on their own that you can just sort of layer on top of another game or plug into another game and adapt without too much thought, and it work. And in doing that, I definitely wasn't consciously doing this because at this point I wasn't even particularly familiar with the movement, but it ends up looking quite OSR-y in a way. And I think there's a lot of DNA there that I think would be interesting to now having a bit more of a conscious idea of what that looks like and how to write it and what I enjoy from that sort of game supplement, I guess. I think would definitely inform how I approached it now.
Yeah.
I also think I probably would have just gone in a bit harder on leftist politics because that's organizing is good.
Yeah, there's some in there already.
A very simplistic way of saying that.
With some of the historical
yeah. So
right?
Yes. Oh, okay. Now I just want to go through and talk about the different different adventures. So one of those that I think like already reflects a like, I guess the development of my political beliefs is that so one of the beers in the zine, so one of the 16 adventure things, is about a beer called Horde Coast Pale Ale. That was both me having a little cheeky nod at Wizards, but also the premise of that adventure is that there is a strike at like a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory type industrial situation thing, but for beer. And that initially started as a conversation I had drunk at uni at a party of like just being like, oh, what if you did Charlie and the Chocolate Factory but fantasy? And I first time around that I kind of like created that scenario, it very much had not thought about colonialization, about colonialism and the whole thing with the Oompa Loompas in that, and also like the weird capitalist assumptions that go into a lot of Rodol's writings, and so when I kind of came to like adapting what had essentially just been a one shot that I ran for the people like a few years back, I very consciously tried to come from a different angle and a more critical angle, and I think it ends up being a lot more interesting as a result.
Yeah.
For me personally, again, I know what I like, and I realize that I'm a sucker for politics in my games. But
I think it's good. I think it's good to recognize like who you are as a designer, what your tastes are, and then be putting that out like very firmly.
Yes. Yeah, and I want the work to be able to speak for itself, right? Like it's all well and good having these opinions and these beliefs and feeling them privately, but then that opens the door for people to take stuff out of your work that you really don't want, and I think that it is good to make it clear who your work is for.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, I'm just a bit lost in my questions. Where am I? Oh, yeah.
No worries.
Yeah, no, here's a good one. So you mentioned a bit about like system neutral writing there, and saying that like there was an intention it was semi sort of compatible with possible D&D games. In terms of like how system, like the only system neutral writing I've done was a setting guide, which is I guess different than like adventures. So I was wondering how writing something in a setting where you're like this may be plugged into like any kind of game in any kind of world, like how did that affect how you were building individual settings and characters in each sort of for each ale?
So there was a degree to which I had to decide on a few like tonal things going in, like or like I guess like fundamental world building assumptions. Something like, what is the technology level of this world? Is it industrialized? Does electricity exist? Is it steampunk? And what that looks like. And ultimately, I think I ended up coming down on the side of broadly adhering to kind of general fantasy tropes, but not being afraid to be more specific and bring something a bit more unique to the table for individual adventures. Because I think that then gives people more of a likelihood to find something that sticks because, and that they are excited to run because it isn't generic. But also keeping enough, like, not making such a large portion of the book be like too far in any one particular direction, such that it starts to become less appealing for people who don't want to run that content.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It also definitely, I think, tries to do, like, I don't know, I suppose, like, another way of saying this is that it is trying to do a lot of different, like, genre stories within a fantasy setting. So there's one that is, like, a reverse heist where you're defending something that you've just stolen from someone else trying to steal. No, wait.
I know there's also, like, there's, you know, a bar brawl set up, there's a murder mystery, there is sort of, like...
Yeah, there's a murder mystery.
There's things which are, like, you've got to get
yeah.
to this specific dangerous terrain or a fetch quest or stuff like that. It is, yeah, like, exploring loads of different things.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of those, like, some of those were trying to represent, like, particular parts of, like, I guess, like, drinking culture, like the pub crawl, but also some of them were, like, some of these, like, plot hooks were generally just inspired by, like, little random factoids I know about a beer. So I think, like, my favorite example of this, how much do you know about the town of Bruges?
I've seen the film In Bruges, and that is the beginning and end of my knowledge.
That's pretty much almost true for me. But the other cool thing about Bruges, so Bruges in Belgium, Belgium has a long, like, brewing, like, history. There's a lot of, like, small breweries and, like, Trappist breweries making all sorts of, like, wild stuff, and a lot of it is really delicious. But Bruges in particular, I can't remember how many years back this was now, but it like can't be more than 10. So lots of historic breweries outside of Bruges, lots of historic pubs and, like, touristy destinations in general in historic Bruges, the town, with I guess the corresponding, like, architecture's not the right word, like, civil infrastructure, shall we say. And what that meant was that lots of big lorries carrying big heavy kegs driving around a town that was not designed to see this much heavy usage, and in particular heavy freight usage, and the vibrations and stuff that can come with. So it was an issue that was damaging historic sites, but also just creating issues for, like, managing the city, right? And so the solution they arrived at was to build beer pipes under the ground from the breweries direct to the pubs, which is incredibly
I thought you'd made that whole thing up in the adventure where it's in. I didn't realize that's a real place in Bruges.
Oh, hang on 1 second, Bruges beer. I'm really worried that I've just invented this.
No, I believe you. I'd assumed that was like, oh, that's a really fun steampunk thing you've invented wholesale. Was my reaction when I read it.
No, that's literally a thing, right? And, like, if you and that's why it's great. It's a delicious little factoid that, like, makes material sense when you think about it, but is also, like, kind of insane. Like, there's a level of like, extravagance is not the right word. It's a very I don't know. It's just it's entertaining to me personally, which is why it's in the zine. But yeah, so that's one of the adventures is just like yes, anding with that premise a bit. Another one is essentially just the plot of an episode of Evangelion that I really like, but like made to be about like a hive mind of bees and like a song of creation that these bees have been singing since the dawn of time, and doing mech combat but with bees. It's kind of insane, and I still don't know how well that one holds up. But it's a personal favorite of mine just because I don't know. It's fun to do something highly specific in your work, I guess. Like it because anyone who like picks up on those references and those subtleties is gonna, you know, it's always great when you spot something like that, right? It's charming, I think.
I remember being told like a bit of stand-up advice I got where it was saying like being specific is funnier, which is always true. I think I had a joke where I was comparing my life when I moved back to Essex to a sort of like sad indie movie, and I made like very niche references to actors, which is funnier than if I'd just been very generic with it. And in the same way, I think like being specific in your design and being specific in the things you're making is just more, it's both more interesting, but I think it's more exciting to read. It's exciting to read something like mecha bee combat in a monastery and go, this is really fun, either because you're recognizing where references are coming from and you're seeing kind of the gears turning in, or you feel like you're seeing the gears turning in an author's mind, or because you have no idea of this stuff and it's like, this is great, I couldn't have come up with this. Yes. I sometimes I'll talk a lot on the podcast and then realize I didn't have a question to add. One last question actually on Last Orders was one I had about like the layout of the book, and basically were you writing specifically like with the layout, because every beer fits on a 2-page spread, includes all of the sort of like locations, NPCs as well as having like the art, and I wanted like, was the writing and layout and art process like very interlinked, or was it just a case of like rewriting to be fitting that structure?
It was a little bit of the former, a little bit of the latter. Last Orders is my first time trying to do a like any sort of longer form layout. It was also my first time having hired art, and so I definitely think in retrospect I should have thought a bit more about where the art was going before writing, because it did result in a situation where for some of the adventures I had to cut a certain amount of text in order to get everything to fit. But also I had done like enough kind of mucking around with like the basic layout that I did have like a fairly good idea of how much text would fit on each page, and like with like an expected number of tables and some art on half of the adventures. And I think that considering how little I had thought about it going in, I still did pretty well, but there were obviously things that I could have done better on that front, just in terms of like making my life simpler on the back end, right? Like, there's no point writing an extra 300 words that I'm going.
But also, I guess like it's a thing of like you learn that by doing it and realizing like, what made your life difficult one time, and then realizing how you make it easier the next time.
And it also, like, I think encourages like what is good general practice as a writer, which is to kill your darlings. Like, or to realize where you're intending one thing in the process of writing it, where something else that you didn't intend to have as much of a spotlight ends up coming through stronger, and so pivoting a bit to make that make that what you're highlighting and building around.
Yeah, I get what you are saying there. So, you mentioned like Last of Us is one of your like first big things. This actually reminds me of a question that I hadn't asked already, which was like, what was your introduction to TTRPGs? Were you into them like as a kid, find them in uni, via a friend?
Strictly my first introduction to TTRPGs was playing 5e in Sixth Form. But I definitely think that there were as a kid, I engaged with like adjacent mediums. I would say I was big into like the fighting fantasy, Ian Livingstone, choose your own adventure book type things, as well as choose your own adventure more broadly. I was a big fan of like the Give Yourself Goosebumps series, and that sort of like interactive fiction, I guess, is maybe a better word for that. But also I very much got into TTRPGs through board games. What was that? What was the Will Wheaton show about board games that he had on YouTube, like in the early 2010s? It might have just been called Tabletop. It was on Geek and Sundry. I think it was just Will Wheaton's Tabletop. But that got me into board games in a big way. Plus, just like as I had friends who also liked board games, and so that was like one of the ways which nerd me ended up making friends as a kid, I guess. Card games as well. Like I was a big Yu-Gi-Oh player. But yeah, so introduced to TTRPGs real in like 16, 17, 18, and then at uni ended up falling in with a society that held like regular board game evenings, but also did TTRPG events, and that was my first time playing anything other than D&D, and that was good.
Makes sense.
I enjoyed that. It was like I ended up essentially being a supplementary DM for someone in like one of the first social events I attended, because there were too many people, and so in a game of Fiasco, the friend running it, Finn, just ended up being like, "Hey, you've played TTRPGs before? Yes? No?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've DM'd and stuff," and ended up just as like picking up and getting to grips with a new system in a very fun way, very quickly, in a way that really like opened my eyes to what the medium could be in like a broader capacity. Because yeah, until that point, I'd only really played high fantasy,
which is obviously how lots of people are in. But yeah, I can see how just even the basic fact of like you can play
right,
genres that just aren't working away from fantasy is very exciting.
Yeah, no,
like about Sleepaway,
right?
I remember the first time I at an indie game meet like played Belonging Out to Belong game, because I played Dream Obscure. I was like, this is really cool. And then when I first read Sleepaway, I was like, oh my god, more people are doing that. This is so exciting.
Yeah, it's really nice seeing people take what are essentially the same like behavioral patterns that you're fundamentally doing when you are playing any tabletop game, but like again, let's just say Dungeons and Dragons, because it's the gone depressed all of a sudden. Oh no. No, look, I enjoyed dunking on Dungeons and Dragons. I don't think it's necessarily productive. It's just tiring seeing so much of the like conversation around TTRPGs being absorbed by it, I guess. If it, in a wider capacity,
anytime I like am
right?
distantly observing those conversations, just as someone who hasn't played any D&D ever.
Yeah. Oh, that must be. I would love to. I would love to have.
Yeah,
that
it's weird because
it
it's like
interesting. Because I feel like there's a lot of assumptions that probably exist that...
There was definitely certain games I wrote where I realized, like, oh, almost the problem with this is I'm trying to do something, and my perspective of games was at a time of, like, writing purely informed by, like, PBTA or GM lists things. But yeah, otherwise, like, I wonder if this is the reason why, like, virtually none of my games involve stats, is just because...
Yeah, one of the things I've been, like, trying to think about a lot more when I design nowadays, or, like, yeah, I guess nowadays, I've, like, have, like, in the last year or so, took a bit of a step away from designing, and I'm only recently, like, coming back to trying to make a bit more of a run at that again, as some context. But I'm trying to be a lot more deliberate about what mechanicization I do use, and mindful of the sort of gameplay patterns and impulses and narratives that those lend themselves to, in order to, like, better figure out how to achieve ludonarrative consonance, I guess, if you want to be really wanky about it. But
yeah,
it's I don't know. It's
like, you can't say it and not feel like a cunt, but it is actually very useful.
Yeah, like, even just stuff like, yeah, like stats and dice. Like, stats always introduce, like, some element of accounting in play, and there are times when that crunchiness is really fun, and there are times when, like, operating in that mode is like trying to say something in a broader capacity. But the inverse is also true. There are times where you can start bringing in like systems of value that don't necessarily align with what you're trying to convey.
It's interesting the way that, like, assumptions formed by the games you have played then bleed into your design, and how, like, more consciously going against that is useful. And I can find the same thing works with hacks, because Tunnel was like, based off the rules of Inevitable by Soul Muppet, and I remember when I submitted a first draft to Alyssa, some of the feedback of different things, and I remember going, oh, the worst kind of... Not necessarily feedback. I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing this exactly. The feedback I found most annoying for me to receive, in the sense of being like, I should have got this sorted out before I sent it off, was feedback where I got asked a question, and when I thought about the answer, my only answer was, because that's what it's like in Inevitable. Where I'm like, I've not justified why this is working in my own game, in my own design. I'm just going like, oh, well, that's how it works and what I'm basing off of. And I like that Terminal now, it justifies... All of its decisions are justified. I can justify them to myself, at least, because of a very fruitful editing process. And because of someone who had not read that base system, you know, essentially checking me on my assumptions.
Yeah, like, a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, like, it's not strictly gameplay, but I feel like you can use similar tools when you approach it, is like what narrative structures you're, like, using, whether intentionally or unintentionally. In particular, how like free act structure and that kind of approach to constructing narrative often ends up creating situations where you've got a threat that the players have to go and fix, and that ends up kind of like reinforcing to a degree like kind of like great men ideas of history almost, in a way that I think isn't accurate to how a lot of problems are solved in the real world. And so, like, thinking about, okay, well, where do I want the, like, difficulty or hardship that players encounter to come from, and what sort of ways at looking at how to address that do I want to encourage, and building that into, and then not, you can take that and start building that into mechanics and being like, hey, do I want violence to be a tool that the players have access to in order to solve problems? And then that becomes an interesting question, because like I would broadly, like, personally, I would say that violence is never desirable, but in some circumstances there is an inevitability to it. But also, you know, like, if that's not what you wanted to convey, then you can tune your mechanics to do that as well. You could like just not give players an axis via which they can interact with things through the medium of fighting. Like, you know, whether that's you don't have a move for fighting or
Yeah.
I don't know. I've kind of run out of steam with this
No,
idea
but like, yeah,
a
the
bit.
systems of
But, like,
interaction players have available to them, and whether those things are like ultra specific or like very sort of generalized, as well as like, yeah, structures of play and stuff. Like, these things all have impact, and I think it's very interesting to, like, for lack of a better word, like, just fiddle with them.
yes, yeah, for sure.
Um,
And like challenge and challenge the assumptions of like the inclusion of those factors in
yeah,
media, and the degrees to which they can both serve as a commentary on, but also reinforce prevalent thought around an issue.
absolutely, yeah. This is a question actually I had that in an interesting, like, was it almost an opposite or contrasting question to writing system neutral material, and I think is a good jumping off question from where we're just talking about lots of different systems. I was wondering how you find like the experience of working in spaces devised by others. So Your Care is a Wander Home supplement. You've written a Sleepaway supplement as well, and you've worked on writing for other projects, like you were one of the stretch goal writers for Terminal, as well as like you wrote something for Skip Fun Games, the Vante Papers, and other things as well. And I guess, yeah, how do you approach that when you are exploring, either in a third-party way or a direct way, someone else's space?
That's a really good question. So I really enjoy working on other people's games and projects and settings, because they give me an opportunity to, instead of being the one who is like, when you're designing your own game, you have a lot of like authorial control over tone and things like this, and also the topics you want to include and things like that. And I really enjoy having to like find my own approach to the groundwork that someone has already done, and find a way to like write something that I find interesting and think will be enjoyable within I guess constraints breed creativity, and it's fun to have those put on
Constraints
sometimes.
brackets complementary.
In a strictly consensual way.
Constraints are fun consensually is a thing. Is the official "This Is Your Life" path position.
So that one's done on TikTok, right? But yeah, it's a really fun opportunity to like look at something someone has already done and find space where find areas where you think there's space to expand or approach things from a different angle, in it, like that both reinforce but also recontextualize the work. That's something I really enjoy doing in my writing. I do sometimes worry that like I focus too much on that at the expense of like writing something good. That's not the right way of saying it. Like there can sometimes be an impulse to be unique, which isn't like actually helpful when you think about it, because like ultimately all media is informed by other media, and yes, but I like finding my own spin on things and bringing parts of myself to what I'm writing, and working on games that are focusing on different things and giving players different means to interact with things, and also just telling different stories is always really fun. And it also means you like, as doing a lot of that like upfront creative groundwork is hard. A lot of work goes into it and it is very fun and very cathartic, but also sometimes it's nice to just be told a load of things that you can broadly assume are true about the world.
Yeah.
In some ways it allows me to shut my brain off just a little bit more than I would otherwise be able to if working on my own thing, in a way that makes the work more sustainable, I would say.
Yeah, it's a different, more sort of like focused experience. Like, I sort of imagine
and also
I imagine the stretch goals for Terminal, like, those are the pages of A4 in the book that have probably had most conscious thought put into them. Versus my work, where because the book was much larger, I'm not necessarily implying that, like, Terminal is otherwise, like, Slapshot or something, but just, like, I think, like, an actual, like, granularity, specificness of, like, words and language and stuff is maybe not necessarily as, It's not as... I'm not as in the weeds on an individual page as I imagine some goal writers might have been.
Yes. Yeah, and I'd agree with that for sure. It also is just like... This doesn't really connect to your previous point, but like, it's a nice opportunity to, like, bring in, like, something just completely out there, not even remotely related. So for instance, the piece that I wrote for as a stretch goal for Terminal was heavily inspired by my reading a collection of essays called Neo-Reaction to Basilisk, and the idea of Roko's Basilisk, this, like, AI god that's going to punish you forever because once you found out about it, you didn't start to work towards its creation. Apologies to everyone listening to this. I have just doomed you to simulated hell forever. But you know, like, and like the Matrix being a franchise that is thinking a lot about AI and simulation, and also just like alt-right chuds. And so like having a look at, oh well, there's a whole new type of guy that has emerged since a lot of these things, a lot of the, like, kind of world building for that series of films was released, and how can I, like, kind of cross these streams in a way that works in the setting but is fun, but is also, like, in conversation with, you know, kind of ideas about Neo-Reaction. And that was a lot of fun, and also, like, you get to do a big cool robot sea serpent, which it feels very piratey in a way that works.
It meets, you know, like, a lot. Like, I think, like, your stretch goal definitely, like, meets the game where it is, while also, like, providing a kind of expansion that would have not been the kind of thing I was writing if I was writing, like, a series of techno fables or whatever, which is the exciting thing about collaboration.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly right. Because you like it. Whilst you can, what am I trying to say? Like, everyone is constrained by their own viewpoint, and part of that is just, like, everyone only has a certain amount of attention and interest to be able to put into doing things, and so, like, even people that you're very similar to with will have, like, aspects of you know, interest, or, like, parts of their lives that are completely detached from your own, and that means that you can bring in some, like, wild shit sometimes in a very fun way.
So being onto a different set of work, you released a diptych of micro games. You Were a Beast, focusing on trans rage, and We Are Still Here. Ooh. Yeah, that's what it's a word for two things. That counts.
I know, it's I've never referred to them as a diptych.
And then, like, We Are Still Here.
Okay, let's go.
Focusing on mutual aid and direct action. I wondered if you could expand on the relationship between those two games.
So, You're a Beast was a game that I released, like, 2 years ago, as part of the Trans fucking Rage Jam was what it was called, which was hosted by my friend Sasha, as part of like in kind of the community of like designers that I was like hanging out with at that time, mostly through Discord, and was ultimately a game about like existence as an act of spite and like a fuck you to to people who are shitty, to trans people essentially. You know, like this was at a point in my like coming out and transition where I was like kind of grappling with that a bit more, and it's also playing with like the roll 2d6 like apocalypse world, success, partial success, fail kind of like paradigm, I guess, but trying to be kind of snarky with it. So you roll 2d6. If it's a 12 or below, you do one thing, and if it's a 13, you can stop playing, which is obviously not possible on 2d6, and that's like the main conceit of the game essentially. But it was a fun opportunity to like just be really personal and really angry and really like emotionally true in a way that I don't think any of the things I'd released previously had been, and it has seemed to have resonated a lot with people. There's a lot of really like touching like messages and reviews and comments that people have left on that game's itch page that like make me feel good about having written that. But in the years since, I have felt that it is kind of not necessarily no longer aligned with my beliefs, but that the idea of existence as an act of spite is fundamentally, it feels like not enough. If you're not trans, you might not know this, but like the situation of trans rights in the UK has been getting progressively worse for quite a few years now, and it's increasingly dire in a quite a real way that like means that for most trans people there's a certain level of like low level psychic damage they're taking at any given moment just by existing in Britain. L plus ratio, etc. But as a result, I wanted to try and make something that was kind of informed by the kind of silly little 2d6 conceit, but that instead of reveling in hopelessness, like pointed people in the direction of things that they can do to build communities of care and to help each other and to try and resist the direction of movement that broader society seems to be taking. And so We Are Still Here is essentially like a list of prompts of like small like acts of resistance, mutual aid, direct action that people can do on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of that has come from my like experience in the last few years of getting like increasingly involved in like activism and organizing, both within a community but also like along like other issues, such as anti-fascism, Palestine, trans rights. We Are Still Here, very much informed by Eurobeast, both in terms of the layout but also the structure of the game, but also like the ways in which what the game is trying to say differ quite dramatically, are like kind of like representing how my
which is
stuff is
such a sort of fascinating part of reading it.
And my, I guess, increasing radicalization.
But it is interesting, yeah, where like, Eurobeast is maybe saying like revel in spite, you know, your singular existence can be a spiteful and powerful act, and then We Are Still Here is saying, but actually you don't have to revel in spite alone, and you can do things more productive than reveling.
Yeah. And indeed, it is only by building community and collective struggle that we have any hope of changing a lot of these things. It's yeah.
It's a hope. Yeah, it's hopeful.
I think it's a good message. I don't know. It was a fun opportunity for me to do some like silly Matrix references, which was good fun. The name is a reference to Morpheus' speech from the Matrix 2, which never doesn't like hit.
It's a good fucking speech.
Absolute all-time banger.
Yeah,
banger Lawrence Fishburne performance.
It's great. Also, when I always watch that, I'm like, why are they always dressed like this? But
and then they have a big cave orgy.
Oh yeah, anytime I'm like, oh yeah, the orgy in Matrix Reloaded, and some people are like, I don't think that was an orgy, and I'm like, you cross-cut between sex and a rave, that's an orgy, I don't give a shit.
Yeah, that, like, what are you, like...
It's, do you know nothing of Soviet montage theory?
Yeah.
This brought up a actually interesting other question I had related to, like, those two games and the relationship with them, because I find it really interesting how the text of You Are a Beast, like, really centers, like, your personal experience as an inspiration for the game and as what that's about. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a certain, like, personal vulnerability that comes through of that, whereas We Are Still Here withholds that, essentially. And I was wondering, like, how consciously you thought about that. Was that related to what you felt was, like, the message or meaning of the game, or was it just a different attitude to being... I was about to say the words exposing yourself in a text, but that's maybe bad. But just like to presenting also doesn't sound great. There's definitely a word here I'm looking for that will not sound representing. Oh my god, yes. Or was it due to changing feelings about representing yourself explicitly in text?
Part of that difference is definitely, I think, just like differences in the voice of the game. And in retrospect, I actually kind of wish I'd maybe captured a bit more of the voice of You're a Beast in We're Still Here. I think like the kind of very punk, angry, in your face bluntness of You're a Beast really hits in a like. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really elaborate on that. It really hits. And We Are Still Here, I think, takes a bit more of like a calm and collected kind of tone, in part because fundamentally We Are Still Here is encouraging people to go out and organize, and there's like an aspect of care there that I felt I wanted to represent in the text. But also just in terms of like representing myself, I feel like both definitely do represent myself. It's just that one is a lot more explicit about it. Like We Are Still Here is heavily informed by like my own like learning how to do direct action and mutual aid, and the ways in which I've seen it work and the ways in which it hasn't, the things that I think don't get brought up enough as like very important parts of that. But like I wouldn't have been, and I wouldn't have been able to write it if I hadn't had all that experience. And I think that being there, like, it says it in a more implicit way.
Yeah, right? Like I definitely think you're a writer who's in the pages of your work very often, whether that is signposted or not.
Yes, no, I would definitely agree with that. I have strong opinions about a lot of things, and I like to make those opinions known through the medium of text.
But like for me personally, I'm always far more interested in reading a work where it feels very much by like a distinct voice, rather than someone who's trying to fit a shape that could have been by anyone.
No, for sure. Like one of the reasons I ended up falling out of love with what I was studying at uni was, I guess for context, I was studying biochemistry, and a lot of the writing in biochemistry is very, like, it's writing experimental procedures, writing academic papers, it's encouraging very precise and deliberate use of language in a way that which definitely to an extent is needed in TTRPGs. It helps a lot in writing like rules text and just making sure that something can be understood and like eliminating like parts that aren't clear, but it doesn't give you any room to talk in a voice outside of a very detached, very academic voice. And a lot of what I like about writing TTRPGs is that I get to do a bit of the like functional, efficient, precise stuff, whilst also being able to adopt whatever voice I want based on the the conceit of the game. I think about like tone a lot, like voice and tone. I'd say are kind of like related, I guess, but like the tone of the tone with which the text speaks.
Yeah, no, totally. I want to ask a more specific question about tone, but actually I do have one last question that relates implicitly to like You're a Beast and We Are Still Here, because there's something intriguing I find about like pronoun use in rules text, by which I'm meaning by pronoun use here I'm meaning a distinction between like second person or first person, the difference between you do this versus we can do this. And, that varies in those two games in a way that makes very much sense, but also can be varied across other things. And I was, I suppose, wondering, like, how much do you ruminate on that decision before writing a game, or is it more instinctual for each project?
It varies. I think some projects I've come in and known that I wanted to speak with a particular voice. For instance, with We Are Still Here, the whole thing is about collective power. So I try to use like group pronouns where possible. We are still here, not you are still here, not they are still here. But other things, I think it's kind of been just I found it as I go based on adapting to the needs of the text. I definitely like the thing that, and it's definitely a thing that I try to think about as consciously as I can. And a lot of that comes from having like a bit of a background in board games and how like board game instruction manuals, like what the default pronouns are always really interesting. Like nowadays they mostly don't gender the player, but like older games occasionally get a he him default, and then the rare absolute banger uses she her default, and it's great. And I think like knowing how like seeing deliberate pronoun use create a very distinct vibe within something, even when it hasn't been used purposely, kind of like very much like I guess woke me up to the possibilities of doing that in a very deliberate way to again like cultivate that tone.
Yeah. I do enjoy like thinking about like the really like specificity of language in both rules text but also flavor text and anything else. It's which I think does relate a bit next to a question about tones, because I was going to say, in terms of like voice and to a sense of tone, like a lot of your works do feel like they really vary and are very like carefully thought. Like there's a real gentleness to Your Care Is, there's a tenderness to A Fall of Home, there's a sort of righteous aggression to You Are a Beast. And I was wondering, both like talking about like consciously thinking about tone and voice, sounds like you're a creator who does think about those things very deliberately. And I was also wondering if you've ever noticed any sort of influences on your writerly voice.
Influence, like, thing is, there's definitely there's gotta be influences, but I'm struggling to think of any off the top of my head. I think one of the first games that I think did this similarly, or did similar things that like really got my attention in terms of how they used it and created that tone and how that informed the rest of the game, is Wonder Home. I'm a real J Dragon head. but I played that. I tested that game, and then also like played a bit after it came out, and the ways in which the essential non-violent nature of that game came across so clearly in the ways in which the book spoke to you, I found personally really affecting, and it made me want to try and emulate that, I guess, and like, you know, take that approach but apply it in different directions and see how that changed how things come across.
Yeah, that makes like sense. Like Wander Home has such a sort of distinctive relationship with voice.
Yeah, and that's part of that is why I was like so excited to write that Your Care Is, that like supplement I did for Wander Home with my friend Kyle. Like I had spent a lot of time reading the rules text of that game. I think probably more so than I have any other like rules text straight up. And as like I kind of like, it really resonated with me, and it also meant that I felt I was able to like kind of slip into that voice very easily in a really nice way. That I think, Your Carries is one of the, like, I think probably after the Fall of Home, probably the thing I'm like most happy with in terms of like kind of overall completeness of the text. Like, it does exactly what it needs to. It's got some nice illustrations. I got to work on it with a friend. If you like Wander Home,
That
check it
actually
out.
does remind me of a question. How was the act of collaborating with Kyle as a writer for Your Carriers? Did you essentially like divide the playbooks, or were you writing each playbook as a back and forth together?
So what did we do? I'm trying to remember. I think so. The like kind of process we had for like putting that together was, we initially came up with like a few playbooks that each of us would be interested in writing, and then having a look at the collective at like that whole list and starting to winnow it down based on like whether we felt there were playbooks that like kind of were like crossing over in terms of material a bit too much. We wanted to make sure like there was a fun diversity of like both like I don't know if vocations is the right word, but a lot of the playbooks in Wander Home like have a kind of vocational stint, and I think that comes through in the ones we did for Your Carriers as well. There's a grave digger, someone who's like kind of looking at death in this world from an angle that I don't think any of the base playbooks quite do. One looking at like plants and herb lore and cooking. One looking at the stars and astrology and what that looks like in the world of Heath. One is Blazeball.
I had not clicked that was Blazeball, but that makes sense.
That was one of my ones. Yeah, I was really into Blazeball during the pandemic.
Oh man, I was as well. What team were you on?
Like that kind of like fuck it, let's go crabs, baby. Love the crabs.
Wait, I was also Craps.
Hell yeah. I did like. I think I ended up pivoting to the garages because I liked that there was a lot of music coming out from fans.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah. And like I kind of like casually supported the Tigers as well, just because I was there. Like the first time I watched like a big Blazeball game was when Landry Violence got killed.
Oh yeah.
And that was like just a very fun moment to see like everyone kind of construct the narrative around is it Nola Turnip or something? It was something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, Blazeball. No, it was a Nola something. I can't remember. I'm good. Comment. Leave a comment on your podcast app of choice saying what the name of this Blazeball character was.
Yeah. leave baseball lore in my comments, please.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a massive tangent.
I encouraged that tangent though, so that's on me as well as you.
But yeah, so we we had a look at those. We figured out which ones we wanted to do, and then we basically went away, wrote them all, and then gave our gave what we'd written to the other person, and we kind of acted as each other's editor.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's fun.
Just as a way of like kind of like it meant that both of us were involved in the entirety of the project in a way. It also like meant we didn't have to, or not that we didn't have to pay an editor, but we were paying ourselves for writing, and we had a limited budget, as many projects do, and so we were like, okay, well, we can edit each other's stuff, and then I'll do the layout, and then
Yeah.
and it meant we had more money for the art, which we got Emma Acosta to do the art. Oh my god, my voice just died on me there. I found her work through I think it's the in-cover illustrations of Lichcraft, Laurie's game.
Oh yeah.
Were by her, and I found them very charming and cutesy in a way that like was like what like Wonder Home adjacent in the kind of like very like picture book almost in kind of the like aesthetic sensibilities of those, and I think they're really gorgeous.
Yeah, I do find the way they interact with like the visual identity of Lichcraft really interesting. And I can see how
because the rest of that game is very like quite black and white, quite like not doodly's not the right word, but like it's fairly simple, like black pen and ink, right? You know,
there's a sort of grittiness to a lot of the other sort of like visual texture, and so it is like an interesting, not necessarily flip, but like contrast the texture of Emma's art. And I can see how that really then is a big fit for something working in the Wander Home space.
Yeah, for sure. It was also just really nice to work with Kyle. I actually met Kyle at uni. She was one of the people who like introduced me to kind of the wider world of TTRPGs. And I didn't realize till a few years after we'd both left that we were both doing design stuff. So I reached out and was like, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And we did.
That's really fun. It's really cool, like collaborating. I think collaboration cool, Jarrett, and it's also like really nice, like bringing someone in who you knew through other spaces first.
Yeah. It was also just like nice to catch up, and like see like kind of what sort of games she'd been playing at what time. What kind of games she'd been playing in that time, and what kind of games I had been, and like kind of talking about like the hobby as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Especially considering like that group of friends was definitely very formative in how I ended up coming to this as a job.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's almost its own sort of active revisiting things. That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I have a question I've been asking on this season of the podcast, which I find like the response to very interesting in terms of the differences there. Do you remember when you first considered yourself a writer?
Oh, that's a hard one. Because I think that like I at different points in time I go back and forth on it, honestly. Which is like part of that is like, like anyone doing any sort of creative profession, oftentimes it's hard to be vocal about the value of your work just because of anxieties and imposter syndrome and all of that. But also like at different points in my TTRPG like career, I guess I've like lent more towards different aspects of the creative process. And whilst I have done writing throughout all of that, it like feels reductive to call myself a writer almost, because I like there's a like game design, especially like tabletop game design, there is a lot of writing, but it's also like kind of like about thinking about interlocking systems and gameplay in a way that doesn't quite map. I also like I love doing the layout for my stuff. I've very much learned by doing throughout all of my like projects, and I'm still learning all the time. but I enjoy being able to put together something that's visually looks nice and is how I like it, like off my own back, because I have a strong idea of how I like things to look, and so it's helpful that I am able to get things to look how I want them to look, as opposed to having to get someone else to do it, because then there's that whole barrier of like having to be able to communicate to the person how you want it to look, which is hard.
Yeah, I know like lots of people who,
and obviously,
when it's like in terms of when they start getting bigger budget and teams like layout is a thing, they like sort of take off their own plate very immediately. Whereas yeah, for me, I find that like I enjoy layout to the extent I'm like, no, that's a thing I'm gonna be always sort of keeping for me.
Yeah. There's also like a real sicko part of me that really likes doing the behind the scenes like admin and like production side of stuff. Like I love feeling different GSMs of paper and different like paper qualities and like printing methods. It's nice to be able to touch something real. And so there's a degree to which sometimes I've been like, oh, do I just want to like try and pivot towards like producing other people's stuff? And I think ultimately I come down on the side of I wouldn't want to just do that either. So it's like, yeah, I guess I'm a writer, but I'm also all these other things.
That relates to like another sort of part of that. Do you remember when you first considered yourself a designer, or is it the fact that all of these things are so interlinked for you that you're a creator?
Yes, actually, I guess I never actually answered the when
Or
did I first.
To be fair, the first question is, do you remember? Because a lot of people's answer is no.
I mean, I probably the first time I started to think of myself as maybe possibly being able to be a writer. I don't know when I don't think I could say when I felt more comfortable actually calling myself a writer, but like it was kind of in that bit just before the pandemic where I was like starting to move towards TTRPGs from a design perspective, but also like I was trying to do a bit of games journalism at that point. I ended up writing like a couple of essays that got published in like some very small outlets, to whom I'm very grateful, to be fair. Getting any money for anything you write is great, but also I've gone back on myself over this because I realized that for a lot of like in particular games journalism, the pay is not there and it sucks, and for people who are actually like doing that full time, it's not good. But like when you're just starting out writing, any like getting money for your writing feels really big, right?
It feels like an external source of validation.
And and the fact that we have to operate like, or rather, the fact that like the value we place in our work is affected by capitalism in this way is a whole other conversation. But like it starts to make it feel like a thing that is more possible, right? And so yeah, like just before the pandemic was when I kind of started trying to do that a bit more. And then at some point, as I started to write more and design more, I guess I started to accept the term, but I don't know if I can say when.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. So we're approaching the end here. Before I go to the last question, thank you for coming on, firstly, but also, where can people...
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. But where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
Okay. So, if you want to play any of my games, those are all on itch.io, and you can find those at winterymute.itch.io, winterymute.itch.io, and you'll find them all there. I'm also, I guess I'm on Twitter, and like. I've been looking for an alternative, and I don't know. I kind of bounced off Blue Sky. I quite like co-host, but it's a small ecosystem there. So realistically, if you want to follow me on socials, Twitter, I do have an Instagram as well, but that's like kind of in a weird like middle ground between being a personal thing and being something I actually use for like my games. So
yeah,
probably if you want to see like my day to day, I guess go follow me there. Be ready for a lot of politics, I guess. Yeah, and I'm at Twitter at Wintry Muse, same spelling as in the URL for the itch page. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like maybe at the end of the season, I should do a supercut of people's dwindling enthusiasm as they say how they're on Twitter, because I feel like the arc of this podcast really captures that.
Yeah, that would be really funny. I debated calling it X, but like I refused to cede that ground. Fuck Elon Musk.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, it's also like complicated because like even before that, like I think Twitter sucks for a lot of things. Like, social media isn't good for your brain a
No.
lot of the time, but also like, I needed to use it for like plug in my stuff, and so I would at least like it to be functional to do that at the very least.
Yeah,
And
like,
the diminished ability to do that is frustrating.
like, social media is maybe not good for you. Twitter now is seemingly not good for anyone. Like, it's not working even at the thing it was doing that was bad.
Yeah, except maybe like NFT dudes. And like people shilling crypto.
Yeah. Spam bots are presumably having a great moment.
Oh my god, there's so many like post-op transsexual spam bots now. I don't know what happened, but they keep following me and I keep blocking them and they're not stopping.
Post-op transsexual robots in my area won't leave me alone.
Yeah.
But that's where you can find Joe. Returning
That's where you can find me.
Returning to serious podcasting. Returning to serious podcasting. A question. The wrap-up question I wanted to lead with was, what do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from creating TTRPGs?
I would say that from creating I mean, this is kind of both from playing and creating, but like I think the avenue where I find this lesson interesting is from the design perspective, is that TTRPGs, by virtue of being in an imaginative medium that I don't think really quite compares to anything else out there, gives you a real, like, it's fundamentally well suited as a medium to introducing people to ideas and teaching them that those ideas can be real, and like by virtue of there's an idea called the propaganda of the deed, which is the idea that like showing that something is possible inherently makes that thing seem more real and more doable, because you know, someone, like, if they can do it, so can you, sort of thing. And I think TTRPGs lend themselves really well to introducing people to like methods of caring for people and approaches towards the world that other mediums can't do to quite the same extent. And I'm really interested in trying to use TTRPGs to do that work, because I think it's very important. And I'll let you know when I figure it out, I guess. It's, yeah, you know, just a simple question, easy answer. No, but you know, like TTRPGs as a tool towards revolution, I guess, is something that I'm incredibly interested in, and like think that if more people did it, that would be cool, because then I'd have people to talk to about it.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's very high-minded and not necessarily the avenue you necessarily want from that answer,
I'm always open to any avenue from the answer, and I think it does make sense that like any kind of learning is a process, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you once again for coming on.
unionize your D&D
Yes.
table.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been the life path of Joe Winter. I have been Kayla Dice. Thank you for listening. Good night.